This week, we will reflect on the Gospel reading for 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time, on 25th of October 2020. Matthew 22:34-40. The topic will be, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And we will be reflecting on how every virtue and every defect is obtained by means of our neighbor. From the dialogue of Catherine of Siena. Let us now listen to the Gospel reading. Gospel reading. Matthew 22:34-40. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest, and the first commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." In today's sharing, we will look into the dialogue of St. Catherine of Siena, which contains various theological topics. In it, there is a topic where God explains why loving our neighbor is necessary, if we were to love him. Let us now learn something about St. Catherine of Siena.
Saint Catherine of Siena. Original name Caterina Benincasa. Born March 25, 1347, Siena, Tuscany. Died April 29, 1380, at the age of 33, in Rome. Canonized 1461. Feast day April 29th, Dominican Tertiary. Mystic. And one of the patron saints of Italy. She was declared a Doctor of the Church, in 1970, and a patron saint of Europe, in 1999. Catherine's writings, all of were dictated, include about 380 letters, 26 prayers, and the 4 treatises of Il Libro della Divina Dottrina, better known as the Dialogue. Circa 1475, English trans by Suzanne Nofka. 1980. The record of her ecstatic experiences in the Dialogue illustrates her doctrine of the inner cell of the knowledge of God, and of self, into which she withdrew. A complete edition of Catherine's works, together with her biography by Blessed Raymond of Capua, was published in Siena, 1707. How every virtue and every defect is obtained by means of our neighbor. I wish also that you should know, that every virtue is obtained by means of your neighbor. And likewise, every defect, he, therefore, who stands in hatred of me, does an injury to his neighbor, and to himself, who is his own chief neighbor, and this injury is both general, and particular. It is general, because you are obliged to love your neighbor as yourself. And loving him, you ought to help him spiritually, with prayer, counseling him with words, and assisting him both spiritually and temporally, according to the need in which he may be, at least with your good will, if you have nothing else. A man, therefore, who does not love, does not help him, and thereby does himself an injury. For he cuts off from himself grace, and injures his neighbor, by depriving him of the benefit of the prayers, and of the sweet desires that he is bound to offer for him, to me.
If we do not love our neighbor, we do injury to our neighbor, and ourselves. How can this be? A. Because we are obliged to love our neighbor as ourselves by help him spiritually with prayer, counseling him with words, assisting him, both spiritually and temporally, according to his needs, and if nothing else, your good will by praying for him. B. If we do not love our neighbor by not helping him with his needs, we injure ourselves, and our neighbor. Why? We injure our neighbor by depriving him of the benefit of prayers. We injure ourselves, the principal neighbor, by giving up the opportunity to offer our neighbor goodwill which we are obliged to do for God, if we love him, thus depriving ourselves of the grace we needed. How virtues are accomplished by means of our neighbor, and how it is that virtues differ to such an extent in creatures. I have told you how all sins are accomplished by means of your neighbor, through the principles which I expose to you. That is, because men are deprived of the affection of love, which gives light to every virtue. In the same way self-love, which destroys charity, and affection towards the neighbor, is the principle and foundation of every evil. All scandals, hatred, cruelty, and every sort of trouble proceed from this perverse root of self-love, which has poisoned the entire world, and weakened the mystical body of the Holy Church, and the universal body of the believers in the Christian religion. And, therefore, I said to you, that it was in the neighbor, that is to say in the love of him, that all virtues were founded. And, truly indeed did I say to you, that charity gives life to all the virtues. Because no virtue can be obtained without charity, which is the pure love of me. How virtues are proved and fortified by their contraries. Up to the present, I have taught you how a man may serve his neighbor, and manifest, by that service, the love which he has towards me. Now I wish to tell you further, that a man proves his patience on his neighbor, when he receives injuries from him. Similarly, he proves his humility on a proud man, his faith on an infidel, his true hope on one who despairs, his justice on the unjust, his kindness on the cruel, his gentleness and benignity on the irascible. Good men produce and prove all their virtues on their neighbor, just as perverse men all their vices. Thus, if you consider well, humility is proved on pride in this way. So the love of the neighbor, whether spiritual or temporal, should be drunk in me, without any self-regarding considerations. I require that you should love me with the same love with which I love you. This indeed you cannot do, because I loved you without being loved. All the love which you have for me you owe to me, so that it is not of grace that you love me, but because you ought to do so. While I love you of grace, and not because I owe you my love. Therefore to me, in person, you cannot repay the love which I require of you, and I have placed you in the midst of your fellows, that you may do to them that which you cannot do to me. That is to say, that you may love your neighbor of free grace, without expecting any return from him, and what you do to him, I count as done to me, which my truth showed forth when he said to Paul, my persecutor, Saul, Saul, why persecute you me? This he said, judging that Paul persecuted him and is faithful. In this way will she feel the fire of my love in herself, because love of her neighbor is developed out of love of me. That is, out of that learning which the soul obtained by knowing herself and my goodness in her. When, therefore, she sees herself to be ineffably loved by me, she loves every rational creature with the selfsame love with which she sees herself to be loved. And, for this reason, the soul that knows me, immediately expands to the love of her neighbor, because she sees that I love that neighbor ineffably, and so herself loves the object which she sees me to have loved still more. She further knows that she can be of no use to me, and can in no way repay me that pure love with which she feels herself to be loved by me, and therefore endeavors to repay it through the medium which I have given her, namely, her neighbor, who is the medium through which you can all serve me. For, as I have said to you, you can perform all virtues by means of your neighbor, I having given you all creatures, in general and in particular, according to the diverse graces each has received from me, to be ministered unto by you, you should therefore love them with the same pure love with which I have loved you. That pure love cannot be returned directly to me, because I have loved you without being myself loved, and without any consideration of myself whatsoever, for I loved you without being loved by you, before you existed. It was, indeed, love that moved me to create you to my own image and similitude. This love you cannot repay to me. But you can pay it to my rational creature, loving your neighbor without being loved by him, and without consideration of your own advantage, whether spiritual or temporal, but loving him solely for the praise and glory of my name. because he has been loved by me. Thus will you fulfill the commandment of the law, to love me above everything, and your neighbor as yourselves. Oh, how sweet is the taste of this union to the soul, for in tasting it, she sees my secrets. Wherefore she often receives the spirit of prophecy, knowing the things of the future. Thank you for your participation. God bless you always.